is Kalen Abe, and this is my Pechacucha for RSOC. Okay, so first, some context for my project. I'm Japanese American and grew up Christian, my dad's religion. Though my mom's side of the family grew up Buddhist, I really don't have any knowledge of Buddhism. I don't really know what practicing Buddhism looks like other than this little shrine, kind of like this one, that my grandparents keep a spoonful of rice in and a few funerals I've been to. So in class, we've been reading Thich Nhat Hanh's book, Peace Begins Here, and we've seen videos depicting how they worship. They dress in robes, sit on the floor, and meditate. So that's what I thought practicing Buddhism was supposed to look like. And pictures I've seen of meditation centers here in Silicon Valley didn't contradict this belief. But then I went to the San Jose Buddhist Church Betsuin, which practices Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. This service looked nothing like the videos we'd watched in class and what I had expected Buddhism to look like. At the service, I found that the congregation was almost completely made up of Japanese people. We sang songs in Japanese and listened to a story, and I couldn't ignore the interior of the church. It had pews like a Christian church, and some of them held what looked like prayer beads. More than anything, the service at the San Jose Buddhist Church Betsuin reminded me of the church services I grew up going to, where you sing and listen to a story while you sit in pews. And it's important to note that there is no meditation at Jodo Shinshu. I thought that meditation was a core tenet of Buddhism. So this experience was far from the service that I'd come to expect from the small amount of Buddhism that I have. And honestly, I expected an experience that was more exotic and less familiar to me than the one that I did experience. So my question was, is Jodo Shinshu Buddhism an Asian religion, or now that parts of it seem blended with Christian practices, is it an American one? So to begin my journey into Jodo Shinshu Buddhism here in America, I first went to the Japanese American Museum of San Jose to learn more about Buddhism in the internment camps. And internment is a key part of the Japanese American experience, which I know because I grew up very aware of my grandparents' experience of internment in Poston, Arizona. At the museum, I found a section titled Spiritual Life, which featured a section on the San Jose Buddhist Church. It offered a history of the church, but said little about whether Buddhists face any discrimination. And this contradicts what Stephen Fujita and Marilyn Fernandez had to say about the experiences of Japanese American Buddhists during World War II. In their article, Religion and Japanese Americans' View of Their World War II Incarceration, they explore how Jodo Shinshu Buddhism and Protestant Christianity, which are the two main Japanese American religious denominations, affected how Japanese Americans reacted to and recall their experiences of internment. They discovered that Japanese Buddhists tend to experience a greater perceived amount of marginalization, but Protestants recall their experiences of incarceration more negatively. To try to make sense of the fact that Japanese Jodo Shinshu Buddhists were more excluded, but also more positive about their experiences, Fujita and Fernandez state the following. Protestantism stresses the importance of working in the world to realize the kingdom of God, such as the case of African Americans who use Christian terminology as a tool. On the other hand, Jodo Shinshu Buddhism de-emphasizes the self and stresses a more transitory, interconnected, existential ethos. This might suggest less perseveration about the situations where one's individual rights have been violated. It also tends to encourage acceptance of life as it is and the compassionate acceptance of oneself and others. At the San Jose Buddhist Church Betsuin, where I talked to Rinban Gerald Sakamoto, I heard this same message again. He said the following.
We have a tendency to see the world through our own preferences, our likes and dislikes, our prejudices, and because of that, we separate the world out into what we like, what we don't like, offering opportunities for difficulties to arise. So if you look at whether it's just preferences. I like ice cream. You like cake. And we judge the world by what we like. If you don't like ice cream, if you don't like cake, then something must be wrong with you. If you don't like ice cream, something must be wrong with you. Seems silly, but if you look at the disagreements that we have, often playing out across the headlines, It's basically a preference that I have in my understanding. And although I claim it to be absolute, it differs from somebody else who's looking at it from a different perspective. We still have our own preferences. We don't have our own, but it doesn't become as absolute. It can result in differences, kind of taking over how we engage them. And so we tend to categorize Buddhist traditions culturally. So we think of Cambodian Buddhism, Vietnamese Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism, Indian Buddhism, Korean Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism. So we tend to categorize them according to culture. When we ask the question, what is Japanese Buddhism? It limits not only the character, but the intent. Yeah, the question would be, what is Buddhism about? Not necessarily what is Japanese Buddhism, because that's just the external. Right? So you could say that Buddhism in Japan looks like this, and it differs from the way Vietnamese Buddhism looks. But the differences in the way that Vietnamese Buddhism looks and Japanese Buddhism looks is just external. The core question is, are the practices of these different forms of Buddhism concerned with the central question? What is it that these traditions are about? And when you categorize by culture, it's going to be confusing because Zen is part of Japanese Buddhism, right? And Zen is all about meditation. So in this tradition, rather than focus on cultivating the practices that lead to the resolution of difficulties, there is acknowledgement that I lack the ability to cultivate that which would lead to the resolution of difficulties.
Interesting.
And at the same time, that I am still able to resolve those difficulties.
Interesting.
So it is a feeling of living with a sense of gratitude for what we are able to experience.
Come from.
Yeah, so when this tradition was brought at the turn of the last century, there's a real kind of concerted effort to westernize its form. So there was an introduction of pews, organ music, even Sunday services, not typical in Japan. But here, Sunday was when everybody went to church. And so, and Sunday school, all these kinds of things were initiated when it was brought here. And so the pews, because when you sit on the floor in Japan, the altar area is on the floor. You're not going to have it up here.
Like it is.
Yeah, here. But here, because we introduced the pews, the altar area was raised. And when you raise the altar area, the onaijin, there is this clear separation between this space and this space. That wasn't intended, especially in this tradition, because in this tradition, the priests are simply teachers. They're not special. They have no insight. The priest and lay travel together. So there's this phrase of ondobo, ondogyo. So traveling together in the Dharma, in the teachings. But when we introduced pews, we raised that inner area. So there's a clear now separation.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, so as Buddhism reminds us everything is changing. Nothing is permanent. Everything is in a process of change. That's one of the kind of three marks of the Dharma. Everything is in a process of change. As Buddhism moves into a culture, it begins to change, adapt itself. It begins to express itself in ways that are meaningful. But the core still has to address this basic question of what Buddhism is about. How do we resolve the difficulties? And in a way, it may not matter that we now have pews and we have this raised altar area. But within the tradition, there's this kind of sense of separation that it traditionally was kind of latent, more in the background. And so it's interesting. We see changes occurring. It's only been here 100 years. It'll be interesting what it'll be like maybe 500 years from now, how it's changed.
Wow. 500 years from now.
Yeah, I mean, Buddhism is 2,600 years old, so I mean, it's been through a lot. Well, one of the things,
now that I had a clearer understanding of how Jodo Shinshu Buddhism affected Japanese Americans, could I connect anything I learned to Jodo Shinshu Buddhism today? As it turned out, I could. Since I was surprised by the fact that Jodo Shinshu Buddhism doesn't practice meditation, I wondered if anyone else felt as if meditation was a core tenet of Buddhism. Someone who would also be surprised by a Jodo Shinshu Buddhist service. According to what Carl Bielefeld says, the answer is yes. This professor of religious studies at Stanford University introduces two categories he uses to differentiate between Buddhists: convert Buddhists, which describes white ones, and hereditary Buddhists, who are mostly members of Asian immigrant groups or their Asian American offspring. Of the hereditary Buddhists, Bielefeld states, the functions are more or less like that old-time religion that many nightstand Buddhists and white Buddhist converts are looking to escape. For the most part, laity in immigrant Buddhism, like laity in Asia, don't engage in meditation, a practice for the ascetic monks who are imitating the Buddha's life of renunciation. They don't expect to become enlightened beings like the Buddha. They just want the Buddha to help them make it through this life and into better circumstances in the next. And Rinpoche Sakamoto shared the same sentiment when he stated,
there is acknowledgement that I lack the ability to cultivate that which would lead to the resolution of difficulties.
Interesting.
And at the same time, that I am still able to resolve those difficulties.
Interesting.
So it is a feeling of living with a sense of gratitude for what we are able to experience.
Interesting. Now that I had two categories to look at Jodo Shinshu Buddhism with, convert and hereditary, I thought back to my experience at the Betzo and how much it reminded me of a Christian service, down to the hymn books and church pews. And it seemed as if those categories were far too black and white. And I want to note that this really alarming swastika on this particular pew in the Japanese American Museum is a mystery I never discovered the answer to. And I can't emphasize enough that it is the only swastika I found at any location in Japantown. Yeah, I don't know why that's there. I'm very sorry for whoever has to look at this. Anyways, in his essay for Buddha Dharma, Scott Mitchell describes how Jodo Shinshu Buddhism suffers from what he calls a double-edged sword. On one hand, the religion is considered perpetually foreign or not really American. while simultaneously being too Christian by adapting its practices to meet American expectations of assimilation. Mitchell describes how Buddhism doesn't fit neatly into either the Asian American and immigrant traditions category or the convert Buddhist one. He emphasizes Jodo Shinsho Buddhism's congregation, which is comprised of 25% whites and also fifth-generation Japanese Americans, people who are far from recent immigrants. He reiterates that incarceration did not happen to Japanese people, it happened to American ones. And this point reminded me of one that Rinpoche Sakamoto made.
Tend to categorize Buddhist traditions culturally. So we think of Cambodian Buddhism, Vietnamese Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism, Indian Buddhism, Korean Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism. We tend to categorize them according to culture. When we ask the question, what is Japanese Buddhism? It limits not only the character, but the intent. The question would be, what is Buddhism about? Not necessarily what is Japanese Buddhism, because that's just the external. So, and when you look at, when you categorize by culture, it's going to be confusing. We tend to categorize Buddhist traditions culturally. So we think of Cambodian Buddhism, Vietnamese Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism, Indian Buddhism, Korean Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism. We tend to categorize them according to culture. When we ask the question, what is Japanese Buddhism? It limits not only the character, but
So, in the end of my journey into Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, I learned that Buddhism is far more complicated than I ever could have imagined. And it's not just a Japanese religion or an American one, it's distinctly Japanese American. So, my next question is how to use this category to extend to other areas of life. And that's something I don't know the answer to, but future scholars can look into. Thanks for watching.